The sky above the battlefield burned in colors no human soldier had words for. A swirl of violet fire and silver storms that stretched across the alien horizon like a dying world, crying out in light. And amid that chaos, Ethan Ward ran through the smoke with his heart pounding like a warning drum inside his chest. He had been separated from his squad the moment the ground exploded beneath them, sending the metal wreckage of their carrier spinning across the dirt, while strange alien machines tore through the sky. And now he moved alone through the ruins with only the echo of distant gunfire to remind him. The war had not ended. He stumbled over shattered stone, gripping his rifle even though he knew it was almost useless against whatever lived on this world. And each breath came heavy as the air turned colder, thicker, carrying a strange scent that felt both alive and ancient, like the world itself was watching him. The wind whispered in a language he didn't understand, making his skin crawl, and when the glowing mist parted, he found himself standing before a ring of broken pillars that rose from the ground, like the ribs of some long-dead giant. Silent and terrifying, he had the sharp feeling that he was no longer alone, a sense that 1,000 invisible eyes had turned toward him, and he lifted his weapon slowly even though a quiet voice in his mind whispered that it would not matter. Then the world went silent, so silent he could hear the trembling in his own breath, and a wave of soft blue light washed across the stone, revealing tall, slender figures surrounding him, their armor smooth and shining like pieces of fallen stars, and their eyes glowing with an eerie gentle warmth that did not match the battlefield around them. Ethan froze, not out of fear alone but out of confusion, because these aliens were not attacking, not aiming weapons, not rushing forward with rage. Instead they stood still, studying him with a mix of awe and disbelief, like he was something rare, something impossible. Their leader stepped forward, her presence quiet but powerful, and Ethan felt the air shift around her as if the world bowed in her direction. She was tall, graceful, her silver-white hair drifting like light underwater, and her eyes carried the softness of night skies just before dawn. When she spoke, her voice felt like a calm breeze cutting through the smoke, and though he couldn't understand her words, the sound held emotion he could feel deep in his bones, a plea, a question, a fragile hope. She raised her hand slowly, showing she carried no weapon, and the soldiers behind her bowed their heads as if in respect not to Ethan, but to something within him, something he didn't know he carried. Ethan kept his weapon raised out of instinct, his breath unsteady, but the more he looked at them, the more he felt his fear shifting into something else, something strange, because these aliens did not look like conquerors. They looked like people standing on the edge of despair, fighting for something he could not yet see. A soft hum filled the air, and the leader touched a device on her wrist, projecting a glowing image in front of him. It showed strange diagrams, swirling lights, and a shape that resembled a human figure surrounded by ancient alien symbols. Then another image flashed, this one darker, showing collapsing cities, empty halls, fading lights, and a world falling into silence. Ethan watched, confused and shaken, because the emotion in the alien princess's eyes made him feel like she was letting him see her people's suffering, their fear, their dying hope. She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his, and without warning she pressed a glowing crystal to his wrist. Ethan tried to pull away, but a soft warmth spread through his arm, gentle and soothing, and the device lit up instantly with a bright blue glow, reacting to him in a way that made the soldiers gasp. The princess inhaled sharply, her expression changing from calm to something like stunned relief, as if she had just found the answer to a prayer she had been whispering for years. Ethan didn't understand what was happening, didn't understand why the alien device responded to him when it remained dark for everyone else. But he felt the seriousness in the air, the weight of a moment that could change the fate of an entire world. The soldiers lowered their weapons to their sides, bowing deeply toward him, and Ethan felt his stomach twist with confusion and fear because he had no idea why they were treating him like someone important, someone chosen, someone impossible. The princess placed her hand on her chest, then reached toward him, her gesture careful and respectful. And though Ethan didn't know her words, he understood one thing clearly from her trembling voice and the light in her eyes. They had been searching for a human like him, not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as a last hope, a final chance to save something precious that was slipping away from their world. Before Ethan could react, the light around them rose again, and the air shimmered as the aliens activated a transport field, wrapping him in soft blue glow, his thoughts racing, his heart shaking, because he realized he was being taken somewhere deeper into their world, somewhere important, somewhere dangerous. He didn't know what they wanted from him, didn't know why the device reacted to his blood, didn't know why their eyes held desperate hope instead of hatred. But as the battlefield vanished and the world shifted around him, one truth settled inside his chest with a heavy breath. Whatever was happening, whatever these aliens needed, he was at the center of it now. And the fate of an entire dying civilization had somehow fallen into the hands of one lost human soldier. Ethan Ward, the man who never believed he mattered, now stood at the beginning of a destiny far bigger than he had ever imagined. The world settled around Ethan in a gentle swirl of blue light as the transport field faded, and he found himself standing inside a vast chamber carved from shimmering white stone, the air warm and glowing softly like the inside of a living star. He blinked, trying to steady his breath, because everything before him felt like a dream pulled out of a forbidden story. The elegant towers rising outside the crystal windows, the floating bridges humming with energy, the distant cities shining like silver lanterns scattered across a dark sea, and each sight made him realize how far he was from home. Alien symbols glowed on the walls, shifting gently as if responding to the presence of the princess who walked ahead of him, her quiet steps echoing through the hall like a song the world had almost forgotten. And Ethan followed with a strange mixture of fear and curiosity pressing against his chest. Every alien they passed stopped and stared, not with anger or suspicion but with something deeper, something like fragile hope, and some of them bowed their heads in silent greeting, as if Ethan carried a light they had not seen in years. He didn't understand, but the weight of their eyes made him feel like he had stepped into a role he wasn't ready to accept, a destiny that felt too heavy for one lost human soldier who barely understood what was happening around him. The princess led him into a circular chamber filled with floating crystals that pulsed with slow fading light, each pulse weaker than the one before, and Ethan felt an ache in his chest as if he could feel the chamber's sadness sinking into him. She turned to him, her silver hair glowing under the soft blue lights, and though her words were still unfamiliar, her voice carried sorrow, longing, and a gentle trembling that made Ethan realize she was not just a leader, but someone trapped in a desperate race against time. She tapped another crystal and an image filled the air above them, showing the Lumerian world decades ago, full of life, color, laughter, and brightness. Children running through glowing forests, families gathering near radiant fountains, cities shining like living jewels. And the sight was so beautiful Ethan felt his breath catch. Then the image flickered and changed into a darker vision, forests turning pale and brittle, rivers dimming until they became silent shadows, buildings sinking into cracks that split the land, and the children who once filled the world with laughter were nowhere in sight. Ethan felt Elena's voice tremble as she spoke, and though he didn't understand her language, the weight of her grief poured into him like a heavy tide. She pointed to the fading crystals around them, each one representing a life well, the ancient energy source that sustained her people's ability to grow, to heal, to create new generations, to survive. One by one, the crystals dimmed before his eyes, and with every dimming pulse, Ethan understood something terrible, something he knew without needing translation. This world was dying, slowly and painfully, and the Lumerians were facing extinction with no hope left. Then she turned another crystal toward him, and a glowing pattern appeared, a complex set of shapes and swirling lines that looked almost like a map of the universe, mixed with biological diagrams. At the center of it was a shape resembling a human silhouette, glowing softly. Ethan felt the air tighten as she pointed to him, the meaning of her gesture heavy and terrifying. He was the match, the missing frequency, the one living being in the galaxy whose genetic signature aligned with the long-lost sequence, needed to activate the life wells, not because of strength, not because of power, but because of something hidden in his DNA, something ancient, something rare. He whispered a shaky breath, feeling the weight of thousands of lives resting on a truth he had not asked for. And for a moment he wanted to deny it, reject it, escape it. Because how could one human save an entire civilization? How could someone like Ethan be important enough to matter in such a way? But the princess stepped closer, her eyes soft with a sincerity that made Ethan's heart tremble. She gently reached out, placing her hand near his chest without touching him, and her expression carried a message deeper than words. She did not see him as a prisoner, or an enemy, or a tool. She saw him as hope, fragile but bright. The chamber lights dimmed suddenly, a tremor shaking the floor as alarms echoed faintly from distant halls, the sound sharp and unsettling, and Elena looked up with fear flickering across her face, a fear she tried to hide but could not. Ethan's instincts sharpened instantly. That sound was universal, it was danger, and the princess motioned for him to follow as the shadows of armored guards, rushed in, their movements tense and urgent. They spoke rapidly to her, their voices tight, their gestures sharp, and Ethan recognized the tone even if he didn't know the words. Something had gone wrong. Something had happened outside. Something that threatened everything. The princess's eyes widened with dread before she regained her calm, and she turned to Ethan, her voice steady but filled with urgency as she held out her hand, inviting him, pleading wordlessly for him to come. He hesitated only for a heartbeat before stepping forward, because deep inside he knew he was already tied to this world, to this princess, to this fragile hope that clung to him like a last breath. As the guards escorted them deeper into the heart of the ancient structure, Ethan felt the tension rising with every step, the walls humming with faint dying energy, the air trembling as if the world itself feared what was coming. He didn't know what awaited him, didn't know if he was ready for the role being forced upon him. But as the door closed behind them and the chamber lights flared to life, one feeling grew inside him like a slow-burning fire. He would not turn away, not now, not after seeing the pain in the princess's eyes and the fading light of a dying civilization. Whatever destiny had chosen him for, he was already stepping into it, carried forward by fear, courage, and a strange new bond he could not yet understand. The chamber they entered felt alive, humming with a soft pulse that echoed through Ethan's ribs like a distant heartbeat. And as the doors slid shut behind them, the air grew warmer, shimmering with pale blue light that seemed to dance across the walls like liquid stars. Ethan stood in the center, staring at the circular platform rising from the floor, covered in glowing patterns that twisted and unfolded like living veins of light. And he felt an uneasy pull inside his chest as though the room recognized him before he recognized himself. Princess Elena stepped beside him, her expression calm yet trembling with fragile hope. And she spoke softly to the soldiers before motioning Ethan forward, her voice carrying a weight that made the chamber fall silent as if the world outside didn't exist anymore. He walked toward the platform with slow, hesitant steps, each footfall echoing through the chamber, and his fingers shook slightly as he looked down at the symbols that glowed brighter the closer he came, reacting to his presence with a warm rising energy that wrapped around him like an unseen embrace. The scientists in the room whispered among themselves, their faces glowing with excitement and disbelief, and Ethan could feel the intensity of their anticipation pressing against him, making his heart beat faster, his breath unsteady, because he knew this moment mattered more than anything he had ever faced. Elena gently guided him to the center of the platform, her touch soft but steady, and when she stepped back, the lights beneath his feet surged upward in a slow, graceful wave, illuminating the chamber with white-blue brilliance that reflected in her eyes like rising dawn. Ethan swallowed hard as a soft vibration rose from the floor, spreading through his legs, his spine, his chest, filling him with a sensation that felt both terrifying and strangely familiar, like the world had been waiting for him without telling him why. Then the platform responded, awakening with spiraling columns of light that rose and swirled around him, studying him, scanning him, embracing him, and the scientists gasped as ancient symbols appeared in the air above him, symbols that had not been seen in generations. Symbols that meant hope, renewal, and survival. His pulse quickened as the chamber trembled, not violently but deeply, like an old heart struggling to beat again after too long in silence. And Elena watched with her breath held stiffly between her lips, her hands clasped tightly together as if praying without words. The lights grew brighter, swirling faster, forming a glowing halo that wrapped Ethan in warmth so intense he felt tears sting his eyes, not from pain but from the overwhelming truth that he was connected to something far bigger than his own story, something ancient, something sacred. Then, with a sudden surge of light, the platform released a powerful pulse that shot upward, filling the room with a thunderous wave of energy, and the fading life well crystal in the chamber flared to life, shining bright and strong for the first time in years. The scientists cried out, some falling to their knees, overwhelmed with joy, disbelief, and relief, and Ethan stood frozen in the center of the storm, feeling the energy rushing through him like fire and water blended into one. For a moment, the world felt whole again, as if the ancient city breathed a long-awaited sigh of relief, and Elena's eyes filled with shimmering tears, hope finally returning to her heart as she stepped closer to Ethan. But the moment shattered, like thin glass when the chamber doors slammed open with a violent hiss, and a squad of armored soldiers stormed in, their armor dark, their movements sharp and hostile, their symbols different from the royal guards who had escorted Ethan. The room fell silent as the newcomers raised crystal-bladed weapons, their leader stepping forward with cold fury burning in her eyes. She spoke sharply, her voice filled with contempt. And Ethan knew instantly these were the Purity Guard, the faction that believed humans were contaminants, not saviors. They pointed their weapons at Ethan, shouting words filled with venom. And Elena stepped between them instantly, her voice fierce and commanding as she argued with the enemy commander, her body held like a shield to protect Ethan from harm. The Purity Guard ignored her pleas, their hatred turning into violent intent as one soldier lunged forward, aiming his weapon directly at Ethan's heart. And Ethan's body reacted before his mind could catch up, diving to the side as a blast of crackling blue energy tore through the platform. Where he had been standing, the chamber erupted into chaos, guards clashing, sparks flying, energy bolts streaking through the air, scientists scrambling for cover as the lights flickered violently, and Ethan stumbled toward Elena, grabbing her arm as they ducked behind a fallen crystal pillar. Her breath trembled as she looked at him, her eyes filled with fear not for herself but for him, because she knew what he had just done. She knew the life well had responded to him. She knew the Purity Guard would stop at nothing to prevent any human influence from saving their world. Another blast shook the chamber, sending pieces of stone raining down, and Elena grabbed Ethan's hand tightly, pulling him toward a hidden exit behind the glowing consoles, her voice urgent and cracking with emotion. He could hear the Purity Guard shouting orders, hear their footsteps drawing closer, hear the fury in their voices as they tore through the room like a storm hungry to destroy everything that dared shine with hope. As Ethan and Elena fled through the narrow corridor, the chamber behind them collapsing under the force of the battle, one truth ignited inside Ethan's chest like a burning flame that refused to die. He had awakened something ancient, something powerful, something that could save this dying world. And now enemies would rise from shadows, from fear, from pride, to stop him at any cost. But he was no longer running alone. He was running with a princess who believed in him, a dying civilization that needed him, and a destiny that had already begun to wrap itself around his life like unbreakable light. And as the corridor shook with distant explosions, Ethan knew one thing with absolute clarity. The real battle had just begun, and he was now the center of a storm far bigger than he ever imagined. The corridor shook as Ethan and Elena ran, the lights flickering in rapid pulses as alarms echoed through the ancient structure, like the cries of a wounded giant, and every step they took felt heavier, faster, driven by the fear that the Purity Guard was only seconds behind them. The walls glowed faintly around them as if whispering warnings, the old symbols shifting with each vibration, reacting to the chaos unfolding within the heart of a civilization that had survived for centuries, but was now being torn apart from the inside. And Ethan could feel the tension rising inside him like a burning knot. Elena led him through sharp turns and narrow bridges suspended over deep glowing channels of energy, each pathway trembling under their weight as distant explosions shattered the calm silence that he filled the sacred halls, and her grip on his hand tightened every time the ground shook, as if she feared losing him more than losing her own safety. Ethan's breath came short and sharp, but his focus sharpened with every step, every sound, every flicker of danger around them. Because he knew this world was no longer just a distant alien land. It had become a place where his actions mattered, where lives hung on choices he never asked to make, and where one mistake could mean the end of an entire species. The corridor opened into a massive atrium filled with towering crystal pillars that sang with soft trembling tones as the energy destabilized, the sound haunting and beautiful, like a song of a world crying out for help. And Ethan paused for a heartbeat as he felt the scale of the collapse happening around them. Elena turned to him, her chest rising and falling quickly, her silver eyes glowing with fear and determination. And she spoke words he could not fully understand yet felt deeply, her voice conveying a desperate plea to keep moving because every second counted. They crossed the atrium as shadows moved along the far wall, silhouettes of Purity Guard soldiers sweeping the halls in tight formations, their dark armor reflecting the dying light, their steps slow and predatory like hunters closing in on wounded prey. And Ethan lowered himself instinctively, guiding Elena behind a cracked pillar as the soldiers passed. The princess trembled slightly as she pressed her back against the cool stone, her breath warm against Ethan's shoulder, and he could feel the closeness of her fear blending with his own, binding them together in a fragile moment of shared survival that felt strangely intimate. Despite the danger around them, when the soldiers disappeared down another hallway, Elena pulled Ethan toward an exit leading onto an open skybridge stretching across a vast chasm, and the moment they stepped outside, Ethan's breath froze at the sight before him. The alien city spread out below like a sea of dying stars, towers collapsing in slow, painful motions as the life wells flickered with weakening light. And ships from rival worlds hovered at the edge of the atmosphere like hungry vultures, circling a helpless, wounded creature. Elena looked out at her fading home with a sorrow that struck Ethan deeply, her eyes softening with memories she didn't need to speak. Memories of a world once full of joy and life now reduced to trembling shadows fighting to survive. And he felt something powerful awaken inside him, a determination he didn't recognize but could not ignore. They crossed the sky bridge as wind roared around them, carrying the scent of burning metal and distant destruction. And halfway across, Elena stopped, pulling Ethan into the shadows as a group of Purity Guard drones floated overhead, scanning the bridge with beams of cold, searching light. Ethan held his breath, feeling the tension prick his skin like needles. And when one of the drones turned in their direction, Elena placed a trembling hand on his chest, steadying him with a calm strength he didn't think she still had left, her eyes silently telling him to trust her. She raised her other hand and whispered into a small crystal embedded in her wrist, and the bridge lights dimmed instantly, cloaking them in deeper shadow until the drones passed without noticing, their cold mechanical hum fading into the distance. They reached the far end of the bridge just as another explosion shook the city, sending a distant tower collapsing into itself like a dying flame. And Ethan felt the weight of what was happening settle over him like a cruel truth. This world was running out of time, and the enemies rising around them grew stronger with every failure of the life wells. Elena guided him into a hidden transport tunnel, carved beneath a ruined temple, the pathway flickering with emergency lights that cast long ghost-like shadows across the stone floor. And she finally slowed her pace as the thick silence of the tunnel wrapped around them. Here, away from the collapsing city and the marching soldiers, the princess allowed her fear to soften into quiet exhaustion, her shoulders sagging slightly as she leaned against the wall. And Ethan stepped closer, unsure if he should speak or stay silent. She lifted her eyes to him with a mix of gratitude and guilt, her voice a soft trembling melody as she attempted to explain the greater danger rising beyond the Purity Guard, a danger that had reached across the stars the moment the life well awakened under Ethan's touch. His activation had sent a signal across the galaxy, a beacon announcing the existence of a human capable of restoring the Lumerians' dying world. And now black market empires, ruthless warlords, rogue scientists, and desperate civilizations were all converging on this planet to capture or control him. Ethan felt his stomach twist as the truth settled inside him like cold fire. He was not only running from enemies inside this world, he was running from the entire galaxy. And every force now wanted him not as a soldier, not as a man, but as a resource of unimaginable value. Elena reached out and gently touched his wrist, where the crystal had once glowed, her voice soft and shaking as she whispered her fear that she might not be able to protect him from what was coming. But Ethan placed his hand over hers, steadying her trembling fingers with a calm born from the weight of his new purpose. He had seen their suffering, heard their cries, felt their dying world reaching out to him, and now he knew without doubt that he would not abandon them. Not while Elena still looked at him with fragile hope, not while innocent lives depended on him. The tunnel lights flickered again as footsteps echoed in the distance, sharper, faster, closer. And Ethan knew their moment of safety was over. He tightened his grip on Elena's hand as they prepared to run once more, the tension rising like a storm that would not wait any longer. And as the shadows of approaching soldiers grew larger on the walls, Ethan breathed deeply, feeling courage harden inside him like steel. The galaxy was coming for him, enemies were closing in, and the Lumerian world was collapsing with every passing second. But he was not the same frightened soldier who crashed onto this world. He was something more now, something the universe had not expected. He was the human key, and he was ready to fight for the fate he never asked for, but could no longer walk away from. The tunnel carried them into quieter darkness, a silence so deep that Ethan could hear his own heartbeat echoing against the ancient stone. And for the first time since the attack began, the world around them felt still enough to breathe. Elena slowed her steps, her silver eyes soft with exhaustion, and when she finally stopped beneath a soft blue lantern embedded in a wall, Ethan saw the trembling in her hands, the strain in her breath, the weight she had been carrying long before he arrived on this world. He stepped closer, unsure if he should speak, but something inside him felt pulled toward the truth she kept locked behind her calm expressions. And the moment he met her eyes, he knew she was ready to reveal something she had been holding in her heart for far too long. She whispered a soft command to the lantern, and it expanded into a glowing sphere that floated above them, filling the tunnel with warm silver light that softened the shadows around them, making the moment feel strangely sacred. Elena looked at Ethan with a fragile gentleness that made him forget the danger outside for a heartbeat, and when she finally spoke, her voice was slow, trembling, layered with memories and grief. She told him of the last century, how the Lumerian birth rate had collapsed little by little, how their life wells flickered out one by one, how every family lived in fear of becoming the last, and how every princess before her failed to save their people despite their wisdom and power. Her breath shook as she described walking through halls once filled with young voices, now replaced by silence, looking at empty nurseries that had not heard a child's laughter in 50 years, feeling her world shrinking with every darkened crystal. And Ethan saw tears forming in her eyes before she looked away, ashamed to show weakness before him. But he gently touched her arm, and she didn't pull away, her shoulders softening as though she had been waiting for someone to share this burden with. Someone who didn't judge her by her title or expect her to be unbreakable. She told him that from birth she was trained to be the guardian of her people's future, the one who would find a way to stop extinction, the last princess of the dying line, carrying centuries of hope and desperation in her heart. And the guilt of failing them grew heavier with every year, every fading life well, every quiet funeral. The pressure she endured wasn't just political, it was emotional, spiritual. A shadow that followed her through every moment of her life, reminding her that she had not yet found the answer, not yet saved her world, and time was slipping away like dust through trembling fingers. Ethan listened in silence, feeling his heart tighten with empathy so raw he almost couldn't breathe, because he recognized the loneliness in her voice, the exhaustion in her eyes, and despite the alien world around them, her pain felt painfully human. Then she told him the truth she had hidden, even from her closest counsel. The last life well had begun collapsing 3 cycles ago, and once it fell, the entire Lumerian species would follow within months, not years, not decades, but months, and she had been living with that countdown ticking inside her every single day. Ethan felt a cold ache spread through his chest as he imagined the weight she carried, a weight so heavy it could break anyone, yet she stood before him still fighting, still hoping, still searching, and he realized she was far stronger than he had ever understood. She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper, confessing that when the ancient device responded to his presence, she didn't just see a scientific solution, she saw a miracle, a spark of life returning to a place where everything was fading, and for the first time, she felt hope that didn't feel fragile or imaginary. Ethan didn't know what to say, but the truth rose inside him with a force that surprised him. He told her he didn't feel special before coming here. He wasn't the best soldier, not the bravest, not the smartest, just a man trying to survive. Another mission, and he never imagined being important to anyone, especially not to an entire alien world. Elena stepped closer, her voice soft but steady, telling him that the life wells didn't respond to power or glory or perfect blood. They responded to rare bonds in the universe, threads of energy woven into existence only once in many lifetimes. And he wasn't chosen by them, he simply matched them, like two broken halves aligning to create wholeness. Her words settled deep inside Ethan, making him feel both frightened and honored, uncertain yet strangely certain, as if destiny had been silently shaping his path long before he ever knew this world existed. The lantern flickered softly, and Elena lowered her head, her voice fragile as she admitted she feared losing him more than losing herself, because if Ethan fell, if he was captured or killed, the last hope of her people would vanish, leaving her world to crumble in silence. Ethan reached out slowly, placing his hand lightly beneath her chin, lifting her gaze to his, and in that small quiet moment, the walls between their worlds felt thin and meaningless, because the emotion between them was real, warm, and painfully honest. He promised her he wouldn't leave, wouldn't give up, wouldn't run from this fate, because he had seen her sorrow, her strength, and her hope, and he knew deep inside that he couldn't walk away now, not when her people needed him, not when she needed him. The moment stretched between them like a fragile thread of light, and Elena leaned closer, resting her forehead gently against his, a gesture of deep trust in her culture, a silent vow of connection stronger than words. Their quiet moment shattered when distant footsteps echoed through the tunnel, growing louder, sharper, filled with danger, and Elena's breath caught as she pulled back, her hand tightening around Ethan's once more. The Purity Guard had found their trail, and the shadows were closing in. Ethan looked at Elena with a steady fire burning inside him now, no hesitation, no fear, only the determination of someone who knew exactly what he was fighting for. He squeezed her hand, feeling her warmth, her hope, her trust, and together they turned toward the darkness, ready to face whatever storm awaited them next. Because they were no longer running alone, they were running with purpose, bound by fate and fueled by a promise that had already changed them both forever. The tunnel trembled as Ethan and Elena ran toward the final life well, the air growing hotter with every step as if the world itself was breathing in fast shallow breaths, fighting to stay alive. And Ethan could feel the tension stretching tight inside his chest like a wire ready to snap. Ahead of them the walls glowed a weak flickering blue, the color shifting as the life well's energy failed, and Elena's expression tightened with every pulse, her eyes reflecting a fear she no longer tried to hide, a fear sharper than anything Ethan had seen in her before. They reached a narrow bridge suspended above a deep chasm, where rivers of pale light flowed like exhausted veins, and the soft humming that once filled this sacred place had faded into a low, trembling whisper, a sound that broke Ethan's heart because it felt like the world was crying. Elena stopped for a moment, her chest rising and falling in quick breaths as she stared across the cavern, at the towering structure in the center, the last life well, rising like a dying star, its once brilliant glow reduced to a trembling flicker barely holding on, and Ethan felt her sorrow settle inside him like a heavy stone. She whispered something soft, a prayer or a memory, Ethan couldn't tell, but the emotion in her voice made the air around them feel heavier, and he gently placed his hand on her back, grounding her in silence even before he knew the right words to say. The moment they stepped onto the bridge, alarms erupted across the cavern, and bright red lights burst to life along the edge of the cliffs, casting long moving shadows across the stone, and Ethan grabbed Elena's hand instinctively as a squad of Purity Guard soldiers appeared at the far end, their weapons glowing with hostile blue fire. Elena's breath caught, and for a moment fear pierced her calm, but Ethan felt something shift inside him, a fierce protectiveness rising like fire in his veins, and he stepped slightly in front of her as the soldiers shouted threats across the chasm, their voices cold and sharp like shattered glass. The Purity Guard charged, their boots pounding against the stone, and Ethan pushed Elena toward the other end of the bridge as he fired the stolen blaster he carried, bolts of blue light ripping through the air, striking the railing and sending sparks into the chasm below. The bridge shook under their feet as explosions erupted behind them, the metal trembling with every blast, and Ethan felt the shock wave rush through his body, nearly throwing him off balance. But Elena grabbed his arm firmly, her strength surprising him as she pulled him forward, her voice trembling with urgency. The Purity Guard reached the center of the bridge just as Ethan and Elena leapt off the far end, rolling onto the ground as a swarm of drones swooped down from above, firing beams of crackling energy that sliced into the stone where they had just been. Ethan rose first, pulling Elena close as they sprinted toward the central chamber, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming, yet every instinct in him pushing forward because he knew they were out of time. The life well was minutes away from collapse, and if they didn't reach it now, everything would be lost. The entrance doors slid open with a low ancient groan as though protesting their arrival, and inside the chamber, Ethan saw the heart of the last life well, a massive sphere suspended in midair, glowing weakly like a fading heartbeat struggling for one final pulse. Elena rushed to the control console, her fingers moving swiftly over the glowing symbols, her voice shaking as she tried to stabilize the core. But the lights flickered violently, rejecting her commands, and she turned to Ethan with desperation filling her eyes, the truth unspoken but painfully clear. Only he could activate it. Before Ethan could step forward, the chamber doors burst open with a thunderous crash, and the Purity Guard stormed inside with weapons raised, their leader shouting orders filled with hatred and fear, the sound echoing like a death sentence across the room. Elena moved in front of Ethan, her arms spread to shield him, her voice sharp with defiance as she pleaded with the Purity Guard to stop. But the leader ignored her, raising his weapon at Ethan with a cold finality that made the air freeze. Ethan grabbed Elena's hand and pulled her behind him, his voice steady despite the fear flooding his veins, and with one desperate surge of courage, he sprinted toward the glowing sphere even as energy bolts streaked past him, burning the air around him with deadly precision. He reached the core platform and slammed his hand onto the central interface. The moment his skin touched the surface, the sphere exploded with bright light that swallowed the room, illuminating every corner with a blinding wave of energy that drove the soldiers back in shock. The life well awakened, screaming to life with a sound like the first breath of a newborn star, and Ethan felt the energy rush through him so fiercely that his knees buckled, the light pouring into him, through him, around him, binding him to something ancient and powerful and overwhelming. Elena cried out his name as she rushed toward him, but the light pushed her back gently, wrapping Ethan in a cocoon of shimmering color, and she could only watch with trembling hands pressed to her lips as the man, who had become the last hope of her world, stood in the heart of the storm that might kill him. The Purity Guard tried to attack again, but the revived life well unleashed a shockwave that sent them crashing against the walls, disarming them, scattering them like leaves before a hurricane. The room filled with a roaring wind of pure radiant energy. Ethan's body shook violently, sweat rolling down his forehead, his breath ragged as if he were carrying the weight of the entire world inside his chest. And Elena felt tears spill from her eyes as she whispered a desperate plea for him to hold on, to stay with her, to survive this. The light grew stronger, brighter, almost unbearable, and for a moment Ethan felt himself slipping, fading, dissolving into the energy that pulsed through his bones. But then he heard Elena's voice break through the storm, soft, trembling, full of emotion he could feel more than hear. Her voice reached him like a lifeline, anchoring him, grounding him, pulling him back from the edge, reminding him of the promise he made, the bond they shared, the world they were fighting to save. And as the light consumed him completely, Ethan pushed every last ounce of his strength into one final breath, one final effort, one final act that would decide the fate of the Lumerian world. The chamber trembled, the core blazed bright, and Elena's heart froze as the light exploded outward in a brilliant flash of hope or sacrifice. She didn't know which. All she could do was gasp Ethan's name as the world changed in front of her eyes, and she prayed with every trembling breath that when the light faded, he would still be standing, still breathing, still alive, because she could not bear the thought of saving her world only to lose the human who had become the center of her heart. The light faded slowly, like the final breath of a storm pulling itself back into silence, and when the brightness finally softened, Elena stumbled forward with trembling steps, her heart pounding so hard she felt it echo in her ears as she searched desperately for Ethan. Through the lingering glow, the chamber was filled with drifting silver particles that floated like stars, settling gently over the cracked stone, the stunned soldiers, the shattered consoles, and in the center of it all, the great sphere of the life well pulsed strong and brilliant, glowing with a renewed heartbeat that filled the air with warmth and life. Elena's breath broke into a soft gasp when she saw a faint outline near the base of the platform, a figure slumped on one knee, body trembling, hand pressed against the glowing interface that still hummed softly. With the remnants of ancient power, Ethan was alive. She rushed toward him, her footsteps echoing loudly in the sudden quiet, her chest tightening with fear and relief. And when she reached him, she fell to the ground beside him, her hands shaking as she touched his shoulders, afraid that he might crumble like dust beneath her fingers. Ethan lifted his head slowly, exhausted beyond words, his breathing shallow and uneven, but his eyes found hers with a weak but steady clarity, and the moment she saw that familiar spark inside them, her own breath shuddered with overwhelming relief. He whispered her name, his voice raw and thin, and Elena felt tears gather in her eyes, tears that had been held back through fear, through battle, through the weight of a dying world, and now finally spilled freely as she wrapped her arms gently around him, holding him as if the universe might try to take him away again. The life well behind them glowed stronger with every passing second, its renewed energy spreading across the city in waves of soft blue light that burst out through the cracks, through the tunnels, through the skies, reaching every corner of the Lumerian world like a long-forgotten sunrise. Outside, towers cracked and burned began to shimmer with healing light. The fading forests brightened as the ancient roots drank in the revitalized energy, and the silent rivers awakened, glowing brighter as life surged through them once more. The people of the city stepped out of their shelters, staring in awe as the sky changed color, the dying clouds dissolving into shimmering arcs of silver light, and a quiet chorus of disbelief rose across the world, because the impossible had happened. The last life well lived again, inside the chamber. Elena held Ethan close as warmth filled the air, and she whispered in her native tongue words of gratitude, of hope, of affection she had never dared speak before, her voice trembling with all the emotions she could no longer hide. Ethan rested his forehead against her shoulder, the fatigue in his body deep and heavy, but he felt her warmth, her heartbeat, her relief, and it wrapped around him like the softest embrace he had ever known, grounding him in a world that had nearly lost everything. The Purity Guard soldiers lay scattered across the room, disarmed and stunned by the shockwave, some slowly rising with expressions of confusion and disbelief. And the leader who once aimed to kill Ethan now stared at the glowing life well, with fear melting into realization, the truth settling over him like a weight he could no longer deny. Elena stood slowly, helping Ethan to his feet, supporting his weakened body with her arm around his waist. And as the soldiers watched the two of them, something shifted inside their eyes, the hatred breaking, the certainty shattering, replaced by a quiet awe they didn't know how to put into words. Ethan looked at them with tired eyes, not with victory or pride, but with simple human resolve, and that expression alone held a power that silenced the room more completely than any command could. Moments later the royal guards arrived, breathless and shaken, their eyes widening at the sight of the revived life well. And when they saw Ethan standing beside Elena, supported but alive, they dropped to their knees in gratitude, their voices trembling with prayers and whispered words of hope. Elena turned to Ethan, helping him walk toward the heart of the glowing chamber, and as the light washed over them, she felt a peace she had not felt in years, a peace that filled the space where fear once lived, reminding her that her world was not dying anymore. Outside the chamber, the city erupted into a rising wave of distant cheers as the life wells across the planet responded to the restored core, each one awakening in a chain of brilliant pulses that lit the horizon like a trail of reborn stars. Elena pressed her forehead gently against Ethan's, her fingers brushing his cheek with a tenderness she didn't try to hide anymore, and her voice was soft as she whispered that he had saved her people, her world, her future. Ethan smiled faintly through his exhaustion, telling her he hadn't done it alone, that she had been the light guiding him through every danger, every fear, every moment when he could have given up but refused to, because she believed in him in a way no one ever had. Her eyes shimmered with emotion at his words, and she tightened her hold on him as if that alone could keep him from fading, because in the deepest part of her heart, she knew she didn't just owe him gratitude. She owed him something far more powerful, something she had never spoken aloud. When they stepped onto the balcony overlooking the reborn world, a wave of cheers rose from below as thousands of Lumerians looked up, their faces glowing with hope, their voices trembling with joy. And Ethan felt the overwhelming weight of what this moment meant. A human soldier who once felt lost and unimportant now stood as the savior of an entire civilization, a symbol of unity between worlds, a living beacon of impossible destiny. Elena turned to him, her voice soft but certain, her hand finding his with warmth that made the world around them fade into gentle blur. And she whispered that he was no longer an outsider, no longer a visitor, no longer alone. He was part of their world now, part of their future, part of her. And as Ethan looked out over the glowing horizon, feeling her hand clasp his with unwavering trust, he knew that whatever tomorrow brought, he would face it beside her, not as a stranger, not as a soldier, but as the human key who had unlocked a new dawn for a world that would never forget his name.